This is my video artifact to show ways I use the theories in my classroom. The first one is Thorndike's theory of connectionism, a behaviorist theory. And his first law is the law of effect, which is also known as the principle of reinforcement, which provides students with positive reinforcements that change their attitude and outlook on reading. Two of the ways I use this in my classroom is the comments I give my students and focusing on student strengths. Sometimes when a student gets a paper back from a teacher and there's a ton of red marks on it, it's very discouraging and frustrating for the student. But if you use positive remarks, sometimes you can encourage them, which can positively reinforce their learning. I have an example here, which may be something I would write on a student's paper, such as, "Brenda, your use of grammar was almost perfect." So I give her a compliment on her grammar, but then I say that now that grammar is pretty easy for you, let's try to focus on finding strong evidence to support your argument. So now she knows something she did well, her grammar, and something she needs to work on. Another way I use the law of effect is letting students gain comfort with their learning by giving them options and ways they can succeed. So as you see below, this would be part of a worksheet they fill out when they're reading. They might have to predict, as always, it's a good reading strategy, or they can visualize or make an inference. This may be harder than the other two, and if you're a really good artist, this should be easier for you and give you some confidence in your ability to complete the worksheet and know that you're okay at some of the reading strategy. Another of Thorndike's laws is his law of readiness. This law states that learning is facilitated when easier tasks precede those that are related but are more difficult. In my classroom, I use this with increased lexile levels with texts and increasing the difficulty of grammar and other areas of reading, like word parts and reading skills. Here's an example of two texts I might use. This first one would be in the beginning of the year. You can see the sentences are shorter, more simplistic than the later, maybe mid-year, end of the year. The lexile has definitely increased. If you look at the assignment on the bottom, even at the beginning of the year, it just asks to make a timeline, show what happened, what is the main idea, write what you think. Very kind of simpler questions, versus on the later end of the year, we still have what's the main idea, but look how complex these these sentences are. And then we have a couple other questions that they'd have to ask at that higher level once they're pretty confident in the lower level questions. Here's an example of tasks getting progressively more difficult with word parts. In the beginning of the year, we focus on easy suffixes such as un, in, dis. By the end of the year or mid-year, you'll see suffixes which are more difficult and blanks where they can fill it in and figure out what these prefixes mean instead of the teacher just giving it to them. Moving on to schema theory, where students use their schemata to build, store, and organize knowledge, I use more cultural literature and using webs to activate prior knowledge to show this theory in use in my classroom. These are two pieces of literature I use. The first is Homeless Bird by Gloria Whelan. This novel is set in India with an Indian protagonist. And in my class, I have had a couple Indian girls who get really into this book because they have a lot of schemata prior to reading. And they use that to bring in their clothing and food and tell stories that their parents have told them. And they share that with the class. And that increases everyone's schemata as well as the girls. Another text I use is Monster by Walter Dean Myers, which focuses on other minorities, specifically African American. And a lot of my students can really relate to this character, and it's finally not a white author writing about white characters in a suburban middle-class setting. And so this character has different challenges with life that my students can relate to, and they can really practice their reading strategies because they understand the content better. Another way I use schema theory in my class is building webs. So before reading, let's say Monster, I might put the word justice on the board, and we would come up with words and ideas and other novels that we've read to activate that prior knowledge before we just jump into something. Unlike connectionism and behaviorism, where we can actually see the learning take place, in schema theory we can't actually see it happen. But as the students get more and more comfortable with the content, they should be able to understand more. Another theory is the social learning theory by Albert Bandura, and I use this in my classroom by giving students a constructivist approach to learning, but social as well. So instead of just reading independently, we will have a read aloud. I use The Giver as a novel to model in my class. So I would be reading all of this text aloud, but as I read, I would stop and talk about predictions and questions I have, and maybe if I was confused at a part, I would reread, and I would visualize in my head, and we can draw pictures so they can actually see the thinking that I do. Another strategy I use for social learning theory is doing book review discussions, I call them. And I have a website that the students would post to after they read a book. And as you see here, here's one example where a student talks about the book Speak by Laurie Hall Sanderson. And she reviews it and actually recommends it to the rest of the students, who then comment on her book review. As you can see, she asked, where does this book take place? It looks different. I like it. I'm going to read it. It's about teenage life, says the student. And the student makes a connection to a book she read last year. And all these girls seem interested in it, and they actually all ended up reading it. So they're having a discussion, a social discussion about the book while reading each other's writing. Learning is definitely taking place here in a social context.